Yeah, I had a tremendous week this past week. I mean, it was so nice out, and hate to even say it, but you know, the days are getting shorter now, and it's gone the other way. But you know, thinking of this story today too that we're going to look at, it reminded me of a little boy. He was at Joy, and he was out of Sunday school, and his mom asked him, "Well, Joy, what did you learn in Sunday school?" He says, "Well, I learned that Moses got called down to Egypt, and he went in, and he to get the Israelites out, and he got them out, and he built a big pontoon bridge across the Red Sea, and he got everybody across, and then when he's got them across, he called in air reinforcements to come in and blow up the bridge so the Egyptians couldn't follow them, and that's how he rescued them all." And his mom said, "Now, Joey, is that really what your Sunday school teacher said?" He said, "Well, no, but if I told you the way she told it, you'd never believe me." And I like the way, I probably think I would like the way her Sunday school teacher said it a little better. But you know, if you think only from man's perspective, you know, little Joey's idea sounds about the best you could come up with. But once God enters the picture, everything changes. Everything can change. So, all right, and Moses is a great example of that, and we'll see some of that here this morning. I'd like to begin by reading Exodus 2, just a few verses, 11 through 15. It says this, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." Let's pray. Lord, again, thank you so much for today, this good morning. I pray they might open our eyes to see wisdom and insight from this passage and how we can apply it to our lives and things perhaps that we might be going through even this day and at this time in our lives. So, Father, I pray again, help us to focus in on your word and by your Spirit teach us. We ask this again in the strong name of Christ. Amen. You know, have you ever heard the story of Reed Joseph? Reed Joseph was adopted into one of the wealthiest families in the country. And he had everything going for him, and as he grew up, he finished high school at a very fancy prep school in upstate New York. And he went out west to Stanford, played football for Stanford, ended up going into the military where he flew bombing runs in Europe. And then after that, he came back and he got his master's degree at Yale and a PhD at Harvard. And things were just going very well. He would kind of be the last guy you would think of who would be wanted for murder. Well, and the things that I'm going to tell you it is a true story. It actually happened. He decided to, when he's in his 30s, decided to kind of go for broke and run for political office. And he thought he'd go right to see if he could become a U.S. Senator. Well, he won, became a senator. And he was one day, as he and his wife were celebrating, they thought they'd go see a premiere of a Broadway play. And so they went, and they thought, well, just for fun, let's take the subway home. We hadn't taken the subway in a long time. And as they were on their way to the subway, he heard the groans and cries of a man, and he turned and he looked, and here is an elderly gentleman, a Hasidic Jew, you know, the kind of wears the all black outfits, and was getting beat up really bad by this large guy, at least 6'6" or so. And Reed Joseph, just his instincts kicked in, and he just took off and knocked the assailant down, just like back in his football days. Well, the assailant got back up with a real mean-looking pipe in his hand, and And again, he reads that, the instincts just kind of took him over in his military training, and he knocked the guy down on his back, and one blow to the throat, and the guy was gasping for air, and air that he never got. And he died within just a very short time, and as he died, you could say the senator's career died too. And, with such a record of those things going on, and having just killed this guy, as I mentioned, this was a true story, but actually his name wasn't Reed Joseph, and he wasn't an American, and he didn't go to Stanford, and he didn't fly bomber flights over in Europe, and he never got his PhD at Harvard. And you might wonder, well, what's left of the story? Well, he was adopted. And only though his name wasn't Reed, because it could have been, because they actually found him in some reeds, but they called his name Moses. And his last name wasn't Joseph, although it could have been, because he came, from the kind of the family of Joseph, who was at one time, much earlier, very famous, almost like prime minister in Egypt. So that's a story of Reed Joseph. That's why his family was in Egypt to begin with. So a lot of you'll see, and as you know, a lot of similarities between him and Joseph. The scriptures tell us that Moses lived to be very old, and that when he was rescued from the Nile River, remember how due to he was ended up being raised by his mother for some time before he got adopted into the Pharaoh's family. How due to the kind of wisdom and the shrewdness of his older sister Miriam, how she rescued him, for the Pharaoh's daughter, and so during that time, Bernard Ram, in his commentary in Exodus, talks about how his mother, Moses' mother, would have trained him and taught him the stories of his people, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the great promises that God had made to Israel. And so he would have heard these things at a very young age, so that later when he became older and he had a chance to choose, what heritage he's going to go with, he chose to be identified with his own people. Now, F.B. Meyer, he writes a little bit more about Moses. He gives kind of some historical information that's not commonly known about Moses. He says this: Moses was brought up in the palace then, when he was old enough, and adopted right into the Pharaoh's family. He was treated as the grandson of Pharaoh. When he was old enough, he was probably sent to be educated in the college which had grown up around the Temple of the Sun, has been called the Oxford of ancient Egypt. Stephen says in Acts, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. But Moses was something more than just a royal student. He was a statesman and a soldier. Stephen tells us again in Acts that he was mighty in words and deeds. Mighty in words, there you see the statesman. Mighty in deeds, you see the soldier training that he would have gotten. In fact, an early Jewish historian, Josephus, says this about Moses, that while he was still, apparently this is a story that was passed down, I can't verify it, but that while Moses was still in his early manhood, the Ethiopians invaded Egypt, routed the Egyptian army, and threatened Memphis, Egypt. In the panic, the oracles were consulted, and on their recommendation, Moses was entrusted with the command of the Egyptian army. He immediately took the field, surprised and defeated the enemy, and captured their principal city, and returned to Egypt with the spoils of victory. And so the facts of kind of Moses' life would be some of these. He was adopted into the wealthiest family in Egypt, so that's where, the story of Reed Joseph, it's kind of a composite of these things that did happen to Moses. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He probably had their equivalent of a MBA maybe and a PhD. He was a highly decorated military leader. By virtue of his military leadership and his membership in the house of Pharaoh, he might have been a logical choice, maybe to even succeed Pharaoh one day. And then Moses saw one of his Hebrew brothers being beaten by a taskmaster, went to his aid, and he killed the guard. So, the story of Moses is very contemporary today. Lots of people today are trying to get to the top of the pyramid, so to speak. Well, Moses, he was in line to own the pyramids, but he made a huge mistake. and he lost it all overnight. One impulsive act, and he fell off, let's say he was knocked from his position at the top of the pyramid. And his successful career was over, or at least so he thought. Now, usually when we think of Moses, we think of, crossing the Red Sea and the plagues and, all that, him leading the Israelites, out of Egypt. But that happened in the last third of his life, after he was 80 years old, which is very encouraging to me to think here, God really used them at age 80 and on. So don't ever think, I'm here, I'm approaching that age, and my life is over. Your best years might yet still be coming. That was true for Caleb, it was true for Moses. So anyway, but we must not overlook his early years, especially like his first 40 years. Because when we study his early years, we discover a lot of insights that are helpful about how God works in our lives today, too. So that's why I appreciate some of the information that a former preacher some years back, F.B. Meyer, shared that I just read. But you could say, maybe one way you could put it, is that God called Moses back to school, maybe around age 40, to get his MGC degree. Or you could call it other thing. His Masters of Good Character degree. This would be it would be a degree that would be mandated for God to be able to use him the way that God planned to use him. He needed to get that degree. But that the MGC degree is not an easy degree. Very few people ever sign up for it willingly. Because it usually takes a series of unforeseen events, maybe a divorce, maybe a huge setback in your career, maybe a relationship setback, some moral failure, something that gets people enrolled in this schooling, this training period, in which there's a few core courses and a few electives, but God gets to pick the courses. All right. We need to remember Moses lived for 120 years. His first 40 years, he was an outstanding success. His second 40 years, he pretty much lived in obscurity and shame after his big mistake that he had done. And then, but he was being retooled for things yet to come. And then his last 40 years, age 80 to 120, is when God really used him. But it's important we must not neglect where Moses was those first 40 years. Remember, he was in Pharaoh's family. He was at the top of the pack. He was again maybe in line to take Pharaoh's spot, perhaps even. In the leadership of perhaps the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and Moses is right at the top there in that family. So he was at the top until he had to flee for his life. Overnight, Moses went from being maybe, one of Egypt's greatest success stories to one of his greatest failures. And nobody knew that better than Moses. And I think somehow he knew that he wasn't in that high spot by chance. That God had a special role for him to help his people. And we get that. Let's see, I think we have those verses, Acts 7, 24, yeah. It says, and seeing one of them, remember this comes from Stephen in the New Testament, when he was right before they killed him, he was kind of recounting Israel's history. And so this, again, is in the scriptures, and he says this, seeing one of them being wrong, he's speaking about Moses, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they didn't understand. So somewhere maybe around the age of 40, Moses understood to some degree that God was going to use him to deliver Israel. But he had to say his initial method for doing it was wrong, and his timing also was off by about 40 years. Let's look again what happened. I think we have the next verses, Exodus 2, 13 and 14. Like it says, when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. He said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He said, well, who made you? A judge over us? Do you mean to kill me? Like you killed the Egyptians, so he knew the word was out. So then, once Pharaoh heard of it, of course, he had to flee for his life. It's almost like at age 40, Moses tried to pull off the Exodus on his own. He knew God had plans for him to help Israel, but, it didn't work. It's like he thought these 2 million slaves who have homes and they're established and their families would just get up and revolt against Egypt and just follow Moses. I mean, he just, expected that. And then I thought, well, let's pause for a second. What kind of a guy thinks that he could pull that off? What kind of a special man would it take to think that I can go in there and I'll speak and 2 million, they're just all going to rise up and they're going to understand, they're going to follow me and we're going to, they didn't understand. But think of what kind of a guy was Moses to think he could do that. Most normal guys don't think of that they're, doing something like that. But think of the self-esteem he must have had, the tremendous courage he must have had, the confidence he must have had to think he could do that. Well, again, and really I could say, why not? Why wouldn't he? I mean, with his upbringing, he had the best of everything. Growing up in Pharaoh's family, he was gifted, he was talented, he had been trained well, he had all the right connections. Success always just seemed to kind of come his way. You could say Moses really was kind of a leader with a capital L. He was a mover, he was a shaker. He could make plans and things would happen, but not this time. This time, it's like you hit a brick wall. But notice again then kind of what happened. We back up again in that earlier, when he had grown up, he went out to his, well, let's go back to the one up at the top there.
That's it.
Oh, that's it, okay. Notice where, actually I want the verses, that's it, one, okay, I'm sorry, I was trying to find it. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Notice that it says that he looked this way and that. Did you notice which way he did not look? Yeah, he didn't look up. Yeah, he forgot about God here. He was pulling this off on his own. He looked every which way but up. There is a kind of self-confidence which you could say is good, but too much of it can be dangerous to your spiritual health. Why is that? Well, because you start thinking that I can do this on my own. I can handle this on my own. And you become, someone who's really overconfident. It's not that, the person doesn't ignore God's help or doesn't want it. It's just they tend to maybe forget about it. And one of the ways you can see that kind of overconfidence is through an attitude of prayerlessness. They don't pray. Remember what Jesus said in John 15? He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. He doesn't say, apart from me, you can do the little things, and I'll help you on the big, tough things. It doesn't say that. It says you can't do anything. In fact, you can't take your next breath of air unless Jesus lets you. Everything. And so we think, I can do this, I can do that, and I'm doing it on my own. No, think again. Even your next breath is under his permission. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So that's why I think Moses' failure was very hard on him. It had to have been hard on him. To think that here he is, his big chance to deliver Israel, and they would revolt and follow him, and he blew it. And what I'm sure probably made it even harder is that, as far as he could tell, there was nobody else out there in the horizon who was going to take his place. So this was his people's big chance for freedom, and Moses blew it big time. What a burden to carry for the next 40 years of his failure. Well, you could say this: Moses had a big midlife crisis at age 40. Look at what happened to him. First of all, he had to move, change the location. He had to move from the palace of Egypt out to the deserts of Midian. That's like going from living in the White House to living out in Death Valley. There's nothing out there but heat storms and dust and so on. So, major change in location. He had to change his career. He had been where he was a leader of men. Now what was he? He was going to be a leader of sheep. You know, imagine how he felt about that. I mean, he wasn't trained for this. He wasn't trained to lead sheep. He was trained to lead men, to lead countries. And here he is out just dealing with a bunch of smelly sheep. You know, a lot of men get their esteem from their work, from what they do. Imagine what his esteem must have been like now, after he had to flee for his life. And to think of it, you know, how quickly all that happened. After his big failure, now he's living out in this forsaken desert. And he also underwent a big status change, you could call it that. You know, earlier, he had all the things that would go with worldly success. He was powerful, he was famous, he had money, he had the best, you know, that Egypt could offer, and he lost them all. He went from success to being a failure. He went from being wealthy to poverty. He went from being famous to being a felon. He had a great future ahead of him. Now he had a very grim future. And to think it all happened overnight. Just one mistake, one failure, he lost it all. He lost everything overnight. Well, and all, in a sense, you could say all because he tried to help out God and do God's will, but he was trying to do it his own way and in his own time. Well, I have point 3 on your sheet if you're following along. Failure doesn't have to be final. And there's more I could say about Moses, but I think, and you know, what he had to learn through this whole process to become fit for the Master's use, and then how that can help us and how that we can apply that to us today. I think some of that I'm going to save for next time. But let me start to wrap it up by saying this. You know, I'm sure Moses must have felt like a failure. You know, even maybe an absolute failure. I mean, by his own doing. And one night, he lost everything. He lost his career, he lost his family, he lost his job, you know, he lost his reputation, he lost his friends, he lost his future. I mean, wouldn't you feel like a failure if you'd done all that in one night? Yeah, anybody would. That's why maybe some people in here today are struggling with thoughts of failure over any number of things. Maybe you've experienced some setback in your family or at work, or a relational setback, or it could be any number of things, you know, that now your hopes and dreams seem to be on the rocks. And maybe you feel like you're out in the desert like Moses, maybe not a literal desert, but an emotional desert, or a spiritual desert, or a relational desert. Maybe that's where you feel like you're going through or at right now. Maybe you feel like a failure, but you're not. Maybe think of it this way. God is enrolling you in his training program to get the MGC degree, a Master's of Good Character. And that's not an easy degree to get. But it's again, it's not easy because the course requirements for that are usually hardships, trials, suffering. That's why nobody signs up voluntarily for that. One guy, his name's Miles Stanford, he says this. He says, many believers are simply frantic over the fact of failure in their lives, and they will go to all lengths in trying to hide it, ignore it, or rationalize about it. And all the time they are resisting the main instrument in the Father's hand for conforming us to the image of his Son. You know, failure is not the end of things. You know, everyone fails. Really, a true failure is somebody who, you know, won't get back up. They fail, they go through something, and they don't get back up. Or they, instead, what they do, they'll pout, or they'll blame others or criticize others for their failure. You know, I always like that statement. It says, it's an old statement. When you fall, well, we'll fall at times, but when you fall like a golf ball and bounce back up. Don't fall like an egg and just go splat. Okay? So that's why we have to remain open. We have to remain flexible in life. Changes are always occurring, always. Like I mentioned last week. Again, I'll mention it here. It's again applicable. Debbie got a new plaque when we were out in Colorado, and it says, don't look back. You're not going that way. That's why we have to be flexible and teachable. and to ask God, what are you teaching me through this? Sometimes we're not maybe quick enough to ask that. But God is molding us and teaching us. Do you know what it is? He is trying to get some things across. Do we know? It takes sometimes time. Sometimes we won't know. Sometimes we won't know completely, but we get some ideas. But it takes time spent with God to have Him show us that through His Word and through prayer. But what's God, the things you're going through, what is God trying to teach you through that? As we seek to get this degree of Masters of Good Character. And I don't want to take 40 years to learn it, like Moses did. Well, or do you feel like a failure for whatever? Maybe there's some besetting sin that just seems to keep tripping you up. Maybe no one else has a problem with that. Doesn't matter, but you do, and you sense that failure. Well, if you feel that way, you're in good company. Because God is consistently taking people who fail and molding them and transforming them into people who He can use, like He later used Moses in the latter part of his life. Well, if they're teachable. So, look to God, keep looking up. Moses didn't do that at that point. Later in life he did, but it's something we always need to keep doing. Apart from Him, we can do nothing. So, we want to be prayerful. Keeping our eyes on Jesus, consider how He might be at work in your life. He is at work in your life. And we can know that some degree, what it is He's trying to do. Because God is still I like this, that God is still in the business, and He's a specialist at it, of using people who fail. And when you think about it, who else does He got to choose or to use? Well, let's pray. Lord, I thank You so much that You are the master trainer, and throughout this whole life You're at work in our lives, molding us, making us more like Your Son Jesus, who's the only one who never failed at anything was Jesus. And so our eyes are on Him, and I thank You that You're at work in our lives, making us more like Him, like His character. Because that's what our families need. That's what our husbands and wives need, and our kids need, and grandkids need. They need to see that character in us. That will be most beneficial to them and to us, and to Your work here in this world. So Lord, we thank You that You love us, You haven't given up on us, You still have good plans for each of us, and You're able to mold us and help us remain open and teachable. And then You can still use us. And maybe for many of us, our best years of service and ministry may be yet ahead. And so we look forward to that. And so, Lord, thank You, our lives are in Your hands. Bless now this new week. May be a great week as we seek to follow You and be faithful to You, we pray in Jesus' name.